It's been a while since we've seen such racial strife on college campuses. Missouri and other proud universities in the spotlight. Next on the Academics. Hello, I'm Paul Gates of Appalachian State's Department of Communication, and welcome to the Academics. Please meet our panel, Nancy Love of Government and Justice Studies, and Michael Wade of Appalachian State's History Department. We've got a number of things to talk about in the race on college campuses, a number of angles, I think. They're in the news most recently for the reaction of the football team, perhaps, that caused the university's president and chancellor, two administrators, to step down. There's been trouble with rape allegations on campus. There have been pushback for the protests that have followed, allegations of racial intolerance of all kinds. So we've got a number of directions we can go here. Nancy, would you like to start that?
Sure, I'm happy to get us started on it. I think the big picture here is the issues being portrayed in terms of free speech versus hate speech and repeated incidents of hate speech, including Nazi symbols and use of the N-word. And what I want to suggest is that universities need to be committed to robust freedom of speech, and also that students have a right to argue strongly against and seek disciplinary action for offensive speech, and that it's important, especially in an educational context, to discourage offensive speech, but not necessarily prohibit it. And my argument here would be that we need to find some way of moving beyond sort of merely tolerating offensive speech to caring about each other and respecting one another. And we had a guest speaker last night, Anjamarie Hancock, who has talked about the move from mere tolerance to deep solidarity, and has suggested that part of what's happening on our campuses has to do with a lack of compassion, a lack of care for all members of our community, and a failure to make the attempt to respect and understand the experiences of all members of our community. So I'll put that out there for a start, and I'm happy to jump back in at appropriate points.
You know, the part of the problem, I think, and Mike might want to talk about this, is that there's a difference between speech, hate speech, and then conduct. It seems to be, on college campuses particularly, has had a very difficult time with hate speech codes, which have been uniformly struck down by the courts and as being a violation of free speech. Mike, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do, and we're not 180 degrees opposite. I want to say that at the beginning, but we live in a culture that, in general, lacks compassion, not just on college campuses, but in general. We seem to have very little respect for life other than our own. And the second thing is this: we live in a culture where people these days are far too easily offended. We've got cause-oriented people who want to get out there and take sometimes then it's not the case here, but who want to take the slightest thing and run with it for publicity. And I think that's why the courts have, in addition to law, have struck these down. The Missouri case, however, as I think maybe you were noting, goes to more than just speech. There's the incident of the cotton ball incident, where white students sprayed cotton balls all over the Black Culture Center, and which was pretty clearly an offensive act. And then we're allowed to simply plead out to littering. Those things require more than that. The fecal swastika, culprit unknown to this point. But the response of the administration was only that the matter was under investigation. There's a disconnect in this Missouri incident between the desire for freedom of expression, which the concerned 1950 student movement is certainly entitled to, and their own tolerance. There they are out in a public demonstration on a public campus, and they're trying to suppress journalists on the grounds that they don't like the way journalists have approached them. One of them said in a tweet, "We ask for no media in the parameters so the place where people live, fellowship, and sleep, the demonstration, can be protected from twisted, insincere narratives." In other words, if we don't like what you say, then we will not allow you to say it.
I think what you're saying there, Mike, is that twisted, insensitive speech is protected by the First Amendment?
And it's like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. It may not be twisted and insincere to an impartial observer.
Or to the speaker.
Or to the speaker, certainly. Yeah.
And certainly, whichever the view, I think speech is protected on both sides. It belongs to everybody, not just the protesters and not just the journalists.
I think I think administrations need to be more sensitive. I think they need to be more forceful, and I think they need to stop running scared from political correctness.
There was an article in the Atlantic recently about that free speech is a necessary ingredient or a necessary tool in the fight against racism. And Nancy, might you take that up? It's some of the speech might be problematic, certainly, and certainly it is, but it has to exist for social progress to be made against racism. I think that was the gist of this Atlantic piece, and how does that strike you?
Well, the danger there, I think, is if you censor the speech, you drive the emotions that are being expressed underground, right? Rather than using the speech to educate about its implications for the members of the community. So, yes, there's a difference between speech and conduct, and speech needs to be countered with speech. And effective speech, for the purposes of educating what racial epithets do to members of an educational community and a broader educational community, which is to make people feel unwelcome, to make people feel uncomfortable, to make people feel that they are less safe than other students. The line between speech and action is a fuzzy one. I mean, I think words can wound, and I think those wounds need to be addressed. I also think, though, that they can be addressed by counter speech and to educate.
It is fuzzy because speech is action.
Yeah.
I think there's something that is being missed here, not in our conversation so much as in the coverage that I think we've all looked at, and it's this. The two university leaders at Missouri who resigned, and many university leaders in many other colleges and universities across the country, are no longer intellectual leaders. Tim Wolf, the chancellor, or the president of the University of Missouri system, came to higher education administration directly from the insurance industry. His experience, or lack thereof, in the university arena is evidence that the business model is really not well suited for university administration. Corporations are hierarchical. They're authoritatively prescriptive in ways that universities are not. Neither is politics, where the business model has also produced problematic results. At Missouri, this proved to be a double whammy for Tim Wolf and for Bowen Lofton, the physicist, who was the campus chancellor. Higher education positions require a level of sensitivity to human concerns that business leaders ordinarily turn over to their public relations people. That's what they do. And that approach didn't turn out so well in Columbia. I mean, that's what we're looking at. The fecal swastika incident is being looked is under investigation. Well, that's true. It was and it is. But more should have been said. A moral stance should have been taken. They're not. Their heads are not there. They're not sensitive to those things. They don't come up in universities. They have not lived lives of the mind.
Well, and there, do you want?
Go ahead, Nancy.
No, I was going to say, what did it take to get the attention of these administrators? It took a hunger strike on the part of a graduate student. It took the football team refusing to participate in athletic activities. And
that's the thing that really catapulted it into the news, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then behind that, too, you mentioned one investigation. Another investigation has been closed at the University of Missouri, which was into the alleged rape of a Canadian swimmer, woman of mixed race, that allegedly involved football players, and the victim has committed suicide. The case was closed without an arrest last March, and that was despite videotape, diaries, texts, witnesses. There were multiple men involved. So that case, which is not yet being covered in the mainstream media, is in the background of the football team taking a strong stance on this incident.
Boy, that puts a new perspective on the football team as a moral leader, doesn't it?
Is that what we're seeing? Are we seeing football players as moral leaders, or is there more to their involvement and the result they got? I mean, it was shortly after the football team inserted themselves into that controversy that those administrators were gone. It was about 36 hours, I think. And is it because of their moral stance?
Well, as one of the writers said, the money which would have been lost with the football game not being played was somewhere between $1 million and $2 million. I've seen both figures. Let's just go with $1 million. That's more than twice the salary of the man who resigned.
Right.
Yeah, it's not even math; it's arithmetic.
Well, so what does that tell us about the power of athletics at Missouri, or does it suggest something else?
Power of athletics, culture of money, and those things in many places, not just Missouri, take precedence over academics.
Would this have happened? Would the resignations have taken place had there not been an upcoming game with Brigham Young this weekend?
Well, they hadn't. We really can't know, but they certainly hadn't happened before this, even though there had been ongoing calls. 9 deans, by the way, called for the resignation of Bowen Lofton. That's a lot of deans.
And that's probably most of the campus leadership.
I'd like to come back to something we talked about last week. The new system head of the UNC system, Margaret Spellings, has refused to engage when she was asked at her appointment conference about her past negative comments regarding gay citizens. Her reply was, quote, "I'm not going to comment on those lifestyles," unquote. She defended pressuring PBS to refund federal dollars spent on a Buster the Bunny program which contained 4 gay characters, saying that it was, quote, a matter of how we use taxpayer dollars, unquote. Well, what does this have to do with Missouri, you might ask? Well, it might well be construed as prima facie evidence of bigotry. Yale historian and UNC alumna Glenda Gilmore has written that before she's inaugurated, Ms. Spelling should be asked point blank if she will spend taxpayer money to provide an inclusive environment for all students. And if she will defend all of her constituents against discrimination, irrespective of sexual orientation. Professor Gilmore's position is that if she indicates that she will not, she has no choice but to resign. Why? Because it's UNC policy to provide, quote, an inclusive and welcoming environment, unquote, regardless of an individual's sexual orientation, and to prevent discrimination, harassment, or retaliation against students, staff, or faculty, regardless of sexual orientation. This is more than just, there are larger issues here, especially when appointments are made outside of the, what used to be the traditional bounds of pools of candidates for academic positions. I think we're going to run into more and more of this, and there's a really serious question here. Are you equipped by dint of your attitudes to do this job? Because that's one of the requirements of the job.
Well, that's a case that's not closed yet. I think let's move on to our next topic. Of course, we're in the middle of a presidential campaign. The primary season is about to start. We've just had another Republican debate this week, and of course, other questions have been raised by the previous debates, and we've got some more raised this time. Mike, I think you also had a interesting thought on lying politicians.
Yeah, not all politicians lie. The ones to watch are those who lie when they don't have to. Marco Rubio and Ben Carson come really quickly to mind because each has constructed bits of their life history narrative which are not truthful. Perhaps for different reasons, but not truthful. Rubio's appears more calculated, and Carson's more deeply seated. Neither is what the country needs in a president. What am I referring to? Marco Rubio would love to have the country forget, or not to be reminded, I think it's forgotten, that when he was running for the Senate in Florida, he constructed a narrative which had his parents as refugees from the Castro regime. And he pressed that until somebody called him on it and said, your parents were in Florida when Castro took over. They came, in fact, I think in 1957. Rubio's explanation was, well, that was my misunderstanding. I got the family history wrong. A lame cover for a blatant lie at which he got caught. He's been very secretive and perhaps somewhat misleading about his personal finances. So there's that. That's calculated. Then there's Ben Carson, who just seems to make it up as he goes along. Perhaps because he just doesn't have a filter. I don't know.
And he has had controversial comments, not on the debate. They were not during this last debate, but I think it was during an interview, somehow conflating gun control with the Holocaust and the rise of Nazism. Nancy, you've had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. The use of Nazi analogies in the gun control debate is really problematic for multiple reasons. I mean, first of all, it suggests that armed Jewish citizens could have prevented the Holocaust. I think that that is a misrepresentation of the historical record, to go back to your point about distortions of the truth. And it's also true that those analogies were used in response to attempts by Barack Obama to pursue limited gun control measures after 20 elementary school children and 9 school staff members were murdered at Sandy Hook School in Newtown, Connecticut. So there's a history to the analogy. And I think what is being spun here are plans for the White Revolution that are outlined in the Turner Diaries, which was published in 1978 by Andrew MacDonald. That's a pseudonym for William Pierce, former leader of the National Alliance and owner of Resistance Records. And that book is telling the fictitious then story of the White Revolution, but it begins with gun control legislation, which outlawed private ownership of firearms in the U.S. and resulted in black citizens confiscating the guns of good white people who could no longer defend themselves. It's the book that inspired Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombings, and now it's being turned around through this analogy of gun control and Nazi policy. So Ben Carson is doing something here that is less than innocent.
I think Gentle Ben was trying to have a twofer. Appeal to the gun control lobby and to the Jewish vote at the same time by conjuring something up. Yeah, I'm struck by how much attention he's gotten, basically for his soft-spoken demeanor. We have a problem in this country when we're that easy.
Well, and it backfired as an attempt to appeal to Jewish constituents.
Oh, of course.
Badly.
Yeah.
The original thinking behind this was that I think that the idea that Jews lie, and they have perpetuated that through Nazi propaganda in the years leading up to and during World War II, is the citing references to Mein Kampf and other racist writings. You've got that
Well,
too, Nancy.
yeah, I mean, speaking of lying in politics, right, and the role of political propaganda, and I would also say underestimating democratic citizens. I mean, what Hitler said in Mein Kampf, and I'm quoting, "The receptivity of the great masses is very limited, their intelligence is small, their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequence of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these points in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan." I think that's deeply disrespectful of democratic citizens. And to the extent that our politics involve sound bites, and involve sound bites that distort the truth or are out-and-out lies, we're in an era of propaganda.
I have a question. Was he wrong,
I think he was wrong.
Hitler?
Yeah.
The advertising industry doesn't think so. They judge the mental age of the American public to be around 14.
And an impressionable age where if you tell them whatever your message is over and over again, that what makes advertising successful, Mike?
Yeah. I mean, it's right there in the history of advertising from from the late 19th century on, it's right there on television every night too.
I think the public is capable of more. I'm going to hold out for
Okay.
a public that is willing to be informed. I think journalists need to inform the public and call out politicians. And I think that we have turned our campaigns into media spectacles and advertising strategies. Does not bode well for our democracy. And I think on some level, a lot of citizens know that.
I'm arguing that too is calculated. I don't think it's any accident that the candidates got asked the questions they got asked in these so-called debates. I think that they did that with the public in mind. And finally, even one or two of the Republicans objected to it. But that doesn't mean that they want to talk about real issues. Those didn't get asked about either.
Well, back to the citizens protesting at the University of Missouri, though. I mean, what is it going to take to get the attention of a wider public?
Yeah, can we expect the audience to develop a skepticism where we would question both the assertions of politicians, we would question the claims made by some anti-protest protesters? Is there hope for that kind of?
Well, that traditionally has been the function of education, which more and more is in the hands of the same people who run advertising and political debates.
Yeah.
It's not a happy picture.
It's the same people running those debates and advertising.
In some quarters, that's referred to as oligarchy, I think.
Not an independent press, perhaps, has been subsumed by the.
It's been bought up by conglomerates. The FCC is controlled by political appointees who are from the conglomerates.
We'll see how this goes in the future. That's our program for this week. You can reach us with your questions and comments at watchapptv.com. Please join us next time. I'm Paul Gates.